She called me a burden. Right there in my own kitchen, the one I built with my own hands 32 years ago, when this town was still mostly farmland and the lumber was cheap, and I was young enough to work 16-hour days without feeling it the next morning. She said it quietly, almost like she was remarking on the weather. You're a burden, and everyone in this family knows it. Then she turned back to her phone. I didn't say anything. I just stood there holding my coffee mug, the one my wife gave me the Christmas before she passed. And I listened to the silence that came after those words, the way it settled into the room like snow. That was a Thursday in late November. By the following spring, she had lost everything, and I had finally found my footing again. I need to back up. My name is Douglas. I'm 67 years old. I spent 48 years working for the city of Hamilton in municipal infrastructure, water, roads, storm drainage, the kind of work nobody thinks about until something breaks. I spent 34 years in construction management. And the one thing this industry teaches you, while 19 past 4 years in construction, pancreatic cancer. 12 weeks from diagnosis to the end. We didn't have time to say half the things we should have said, and I have lived with that ever since. My son, my only child, is 38. He met Renata at a conference in Toronto, married her 18 months later, in a ceremony that cost more than my first car and my second car combined. I liked her at first. She was sharp, well-dressed, knew how to hold a room. My son looked at her the way I used to look at Elaine. That mattered to me. They moved to Hamilton 2 years after the wedding, which I thought was because they wanted to be closer to family. I understand now that the house prices in Hamilton were lower than they needed, and that I was a resource, not a reason. Their daughter, my granddaughter, was born the following May. I was in the waiting room for 6 hours, pacing until the soles of my shoes left marks. When the nurse brought her out and I held her for the first time, I thought, this is it. This is the thing that makes sense of everything. She had Elaine's ears. I noticed that right away. Little rounded tops, just like her grandmother's. I called her Button because she was small and perfect, and because some nicknames just arrive without asking permission. For the first year, I was there 3-4 days a week. I drove them to appointments. I fixed the deck that my son kept saying he'd get to. I watched Button when Renata needed to sleep, when she needed to run errands, when she simply needed 2 hours where no one was asking her for anything. I didn't keep score. That's not how family works. That's not how I was raised. And it's not how I raised my son. But somewhere in that first year, something shifted. I didn't see it at the time. You don't when you're in the middle of it. You just keep showing up because you love the people and you don't want to believe what you're starting to feel. Renata began correcting me in front of Button. Small things at first. The way I held her, the temperature of a bath, the brand of wipes I bought. I adjusted. I told myself she was a new mother and new mothers are anxious and that's normal and I should give her room. Then it moved to how I spoke, then to how long I stayed, then to whether I called ahead or just showed up, which I had been doing my whole life because my son had grown up in a house where the door was always unlocked and nobody needed an appointment to walk into their own family. By Button's second birthday, I needed to call 48 hours in advance to visit. By her third birthday, the visits had been reduced by some process I didn't fully understand to Sunday afternoons from 2 to 5. My son never said this directly. It arrived the way many things arrived in that house, through Renata, framed as logistics, framed as schedules, framed as what works for everyone. I went along with it. I told myself I was being flexible. I told myself that every family finds its rhythm. Then Elaine's sister passed and left me a small inheritance, $46,000. Nothing that changes your life, but something. I put it in a GIC at my credit union in Dundas. I didn't tell anyone. It wasn't a secret exactly, just private. The way some things are private, Renata found out. I don't know how. My son, probably, who had probably seen a statement, who had probably mentioned it without thinking. 3 weeks after I deposited that money, she brought it up over Sunday dinner. Casually, the way she brought most things up, as though it had just occurred to her, as though she wasn't watching my face very carefully while she said it. Doug, with interest rates the way they are, you're really losing money keeping savings in a GIC. Graham and I have been talking, and we think it would make much more sense to put that money into the renovation. We'd pay you back. In equity. Graham, my son. He was looking at his plate. I said I'd think about it. She said they needed an answer by the end of the month because the contractor had a window. I asked what contractor, what renovation. She described an addition on the back of their house. A sunroom, she said, though the budget she quoted was not a sunroom budget. The whole thing would run close to 80,000. They had 30 saved. They wanted 46 from me, and the remaining few thousand from somewhere she didn't specify. I spent 34 years in construction management, she said, and I'm telling you this exactly as she said it, because I've turned it over in my mind more times than I can count. She said, "You're not getting any younger, Doug. You're not going to use that money for anything meaningful. At least this way it stays in the family." I drove home on the 403 in the dark and I sat in my driveway for 20 minutes before I went inside. I didn't transfer the money. She stopped inviting me for Sunday dinner the following week. My son called to say that Renata was overwhelmed and they needed some space and could I maybe just come by one Sunday a month for now? I said yes. I said of course. I said whatever you need. That night, I got down my wife's recipe box from the cupboard above the fridge. The wooden one she painted blue with the little flowers on the lid, and I sat at the kitchen table and I read through her handwriting for an hour. Her hand was neat and slanted, and she always wrote the source of a recipe in brackets at the bottom. From Bev's mother. From the Church Cookbook 1987. From that B&B in Prince Edward County. I sat there reading them like letters. I thought about who I had become in that family. Not a father, not a grandfather, a resource that had failed to deliver and was now being quietly managed. That was the first time something hardened in me. Not anger, not yet. Something quieter. A decision. I called my financial advisor the next morning. Her name is Patricia. Wait, no. Her name is Angela. She's been handling my retirement accounts for 12 years. I told her I wanted to restructure some things. I wanted everything reviewed, documented, updated. I asked about my will specifically. I had named my son as primary beneficiary across everything. The house, the pension survivor benefit, the registered accounts, all of it. Angela walked me through my options without asking too many questions, which is one of the things I appreciate about her. I made some changes. I didn't tell anyone. 3 weeks later is when Renata slapped me. I want to be careful about how I describe this, because I don't want to dramatize it. What happened was this. I came to the house on a Saturday unannounced, which I understand now was a violation of the new rules, though the new rules had never been stated to me directly, because Button had left her stuffed rabbit at my house the Sunday before and she had been asking for it, according to a text my son had sent me on Wednesday. I knocked. I had the rabbit. Renata opened the door. She looked at me the way you look at something you didn't order arriving at your door. She said I should have called. I said Graham had texted me about the rabbit. She said that wasn't an invitation. I said I was only dropping it off. She said I always did this. Always found a reason. Always pushed. Always made everything about myself. And that she was tired of it. That the whole family was tired of it. That I needed to understand my place. I said quietly that I was Button's grandfather and that I was standing on a public sidewalk holding my granddaughter's stuffed rabbit. She slapped me, open hand, across the left side of my face. It wasn't hard enough to knock me sideways, but it was hard enough to make a sound, and I heard Button somewhere inside the house say, "Daddy," in that high voice she has, the one that makes everything feel more serious. I handed Renata the rabbit. I said, "Tell Button I'll see her soon." I walked back to my truck. I sat there for a moment. Then I drove to the Tim Hortons on Drymal Road and I ordered a medium double-double and I sat in the parking lot and I made a plan. My son called that evening. He said Renata was upset. He said she hadn't meant for it to go that far. He said I needed to understand that she was under a lot of pressure and that sometimes people reach their limits and that he hoped I could find a way to move forward without making things worse. He did not say sorry. He said she was upset. I have been a father for 38 years. I know the difference. I said, "All right, Glam, I hear you." I hung up the phone. I looked out the window at the backyard where Elaine's apple tree was just starting to bud. She planted it the year Graham started school, and it gives fruit every October without fail. And I thought, I am not going to react. I am going to respond, and I am going to take my time. I spent the next 3 months living quietly. I kept my Sunday visits, one a month, which I attended without complaint, and left exactly on time. I brought Button small things, a library book, a little potted plant she could water herself. The kind of carefree gifts that don't give anyone anything to object to. I was pleasant to Renata. I did not bring up the slap. I did not bring up the money. I did not bring up any of it. But I was not idle. I had coffee twice a week with my old friend from the city, a man named Cecil who had retired from the legal department and still knew everyone worth knowing in Hamilton. I mentioned over time some of what was happening. Not all of it, but enough. Cecil mentioned a woman he knew, a family lawyer he'd worked with on an estate dispute years earlier. Sharp, he said. Thorough. Good with situations where documentation matters. I made an appointment. I also quietly began keeping records. Nothing dramatic. Just dates and times. What was said. What changed. When my access to buttons shifted and why. I kept it in a small notebook in the drawer by my bed. Not because I knew exactly what I'd do with it, but because I'd worked in municipal infrastructure long enough to know that when something is going wrong, you document it before you need the documentation, not after. That spring, my son called to tell me that the contractor window had reopened and that they were moving ahead with the renovation. He asked one more time if I had reconsidered. He framed it as a fresh start, a way to be more involved with the family. Said Renata had come around to the idea of me being more present if things could be structured better. I thought about that phrase, structured better. I thought about the rabbit. I thought about the parking lot at Tim Hortons. I thought about Elaine's handwriting in the recipe box and what she would have thought of all this. Elaine, who could read a room faster than anyone I've ever met, who would have seen Renata for exactly what she was in the first 20 minutes, and would have squeezed my hand under the table to tell me she saw it too. I told my son I'd need a few weeks to think it over. He said he understood. He sounded relieved that I hadn't said no outright. I wasn't thinking it over. I was almost ready. The lawyer had helped me update my will entirely. The house would go into a trust, administered by Angela, with conditions. A portion was designated for Button's education, a registered education savings account in her name, controlled by a trustee, not by her parent. The remainder went to 3 organizations: a hospice in Ancaster where Elaine had spent her last 2 weeks, a youth shelter in the lower city that my wife used to volunteer at, and the Hamilton Community Foundation. My son was not cut out entirely, but what remained for him was modest and conditional on certain things I won't get into here. This was not done in anger. I want to be clear about that. I didn't wake up one day in a rage and cross his name out. I did it the way I did everything. Slowly, carefully, with a full understanding of what I was choosing, the version of events in which my son was Elaine's, and my primary legacy had depended on a version of our family that no longer existed. The other thing I did was call my GP and finally get the knee looked at. I don't know why that felt connected, but it did. In late April, I invited my son and Renata to dinner. At my house, I told them I had made a decision about the money and I wanted to share it in person. I told Graham to come for 6 o'clock, that I was making a proper meal. Renata, I was told later, assumed I had agreed. She wore a nice blouse. What she didn't know was that I had also invited Cecil, who had been my witness to certain conversations over the past months. And I had invited Angela, who brought a folder. And I had invited a woman named Gail from the city's Adult Protective Services Division. Not officially, not in any enforcement capacity, just as a friend of a friend who I had met through Cecil and who had agreed to be present as a quiet witness. And I had called my son's uncle on Elaine's side, a man named Terence, who Graham had always respected, who lived in Guelph and who had driven 2 hours because I had asked him to and because I had told him plainly what had happened in front of my house on that Saturday with the rabbit. Terence brought his wife. They sat at the long end of my dining room table, which I had extended for the first time since Elaine's last Christmas, and I had set it properly. The good plates, the cloth napkins, candles. I made roast chicken with root vegetables, the way Elaine used to do it with fresh thyme from the garden, and I made her butter tart recipe for dessert, the one from the card that said Bev's mother at the bottom. When Graham and Renata arrived and saw who was sitting at the table, Renata stopped in the doorway. Just for a moment. Just long enough. I said, "Come in. Please sit down." She sat. Graham sat. He looked at Terence, then at Angela's folder, then at me. I didn't make a speech. I'm not a speech person. I served the food. I poured the water. When we were all settled, I said, "I've made my decisions about the estate and about some other things, and I wanted the people I trust to be here when I explained them. I thought it was important that Graham hear this from me directly and that they be witnesses. I looked at my son. I said, I love you. I have loved you since before you took your first breath, and I need you to understand that what has happened in this family over the last 2 years, what was said in my kitchen, what happened on my front walk, the way my access to my granddaughter has been controlled. None of that was acceptable, and I am not willing to pretend otherwise anymore. Renata started to speak. Cecil looked at her very calmly and she stopped. I walked Graham through the changes to the will. Angela had copies for everyone. I explained the education trustful button, that it was there, that it was protected. That button would have options when the time came, regardless of anything else. I watched my son's face when he understood that I had not abandoned his daughter, that I had thought of her, that the thing I had built was not punishment, but provision. He cried, not dramatically, just quietly, in the way that men of a certain generation cry when they finally understand they were wrong and it cost them something real. Renata left before dessert. She didn't say anything when she left, she just picked up her bag and walked out. I heard the car in the driveway. Then Terence's wife went into the kitchen and came back with the butter tarts, and we ate them at the table with the candles still burning. My son stayed. He helped me with the dishes afterward. We didn't talk much. Some things don't need to be said immediately. Some things need to sit. He called me the following Tuesday. He said he and Renata were separating. He said it as though he was reporting a fact, not asking for my reaction. I told him I was sorry because I was not for him and Renata, but for Button, who would now grow up in 2 houses instead of one, which is not the worst thing in the world, but it is not nothing either. He asked if he could bring Button to see me that weekend. I spent 34 years in construction management. She arrived in her yellow raincoat, even though it wasn't raining. She had her stuffed rabbit in her arms, the same one I had carried to that front door. She came up my front walk with her boots going slap slap on the wet flagstones, and when she saw me, she said, Grandpa, can we make something? And I said, absolutely. What did she have in mind? She said she wanted to grow something. So we went to the garage and I found a seed packet, tomatoes, the cherry kind, and we filled 3 small pots with soil and she pressed the seeds in with her little finger, one by one, very seriously, like someone who understood the weight of the task. She is 4 years old. She does not know what happened in this family or what it cost or what I chose. She knows that I show up. She knows that I have apple juice in the fridge and that I let her wear my old work gloves even though they go up to her elbows. She knows that I am hers. That is enough. That is, in fact, more than enough. The tomatoes came up in July. She named every single one. I keep thinking about that Saturday in November, the coffee mug in my hand, the silence after she said it. There's a version of me that argued back, that raised his voice, that let the hurt out, right there in the kitchen the way you want to when someone says something that cuts that deep. But that version of me wouldn't have kept Button. That version of me would have lost everything that actually mattered. What I've come to understand is that the way things end is almost always a direct result of the choices made in the quiet moments, not the loud ones. Renata didn't lose because I fought her. She lost because I didn't. I chose again and again to act with integrity when the easier thing would have been to react. That's not passivity. That's something harder. It's deciding that the kind of person you want to be matters more than the satisfaction of winning an argument in the moment. I've been thinking about what my wife Elaine would call it. She was a practical woman. She didn't have a lot of patience for abstraction. She would have said something like, Doug, you just did the right thing in the right order. That's it. No more complicated than that. You know what's right. You find the patience to wait until the timing makes it count. Then you do it. The patience part, that's the piece nobody talks about. I sat on what happened for months. I kept my Sunday visits. I brought Button her library books. I smiled at a woman who had struck me across the face in my own driveway. Not because I had forgiven it, but because I knew that the most powerful thing I could do was refuse to become smaller than I was. Anger makes you smaller. Bitterness makes you smaller. I had watched enough men my age shrink into those feelings and stay there for the rest of their lives, and I was not willing to do that. The clarity I found about what to keep, what to protect, what to let go, that didn't come from anywhere dramatic. It came from sitting at my kitchen table with Elaine's recipe box and asking myself what I actually valued. Button's education. The hospice where Elaine died with some dignity. The shelter my wife gave her time to. Those things were true. Those things were mine. Once I knew what I was protecting, the rest became straightforward. My son stayed and helped with the dishes. That meant something. People will tell you that blood ties are unconditional, but I think what's actually unconditional is love. And love, unlike blood, is a choice you make and keep making. Dram made it that night, standing at the sink, not saying much. I think he is still making it. I think it is costing him something real, and I respect him for paying it. Button pressed those tomato seeds in with one finger, very deliberately, and looked up at me to make sure she was doing it right. That look is what I work for. Not the will, not the dinner, not any of it. Just that look and the chance to be there for it. That is what a life of doing right tends to leave you with if you're patient enough. Not everything, but the things that count.